The first letter was laughably petty, even for Brenda. Grass height, fractionally over the ordained 3 inches. The laminated card, slipped under my wiper blade, felt like a declaration of war in miniature. It was always Brenda, self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. Her reign built on a foundation of beige paint swatches and the fear of $20 fines. I crumpled it, tossed it. A tactical error, I'd later concede. Underestimating Brenda was like underestimating a cornered badger armed with a clipboard and an inexhaustible supply of passive aggression. My wife Sarah just sighed when I told her. Again? What is it with that woman and our lawn? Our lawn, mind you, was a testament to suburban conformity, a verdant carpet indistinguishable from its neighbors, save for the invisible line Brenda patrolled with the zeal of a border guard. This was phase 1 of her typical campaign: establish dominance through minutia. My daughter Lily, drawing chalk flowers on the driveway, received a stern lecture about community property aesthetics. The flowers were admittedly vibrant. Perhaps too vibrant for Brenda's monochromatic soul. I watched from the window, a cold knot tightening in my chest. It wasn't the chalk, not really. It was the slow, creeping encroachment, the way she made my little girl's eyes well up. Lily came inside, lower lip trembling. Mrs. Henderson said my flowers are messy. I knelt, wiped a smudge of pink from her cheek. Mrs. Henderson, I said, keeping my voice even, sometimes forgets what joy looks like. But the joy was already dimming, replaced by a child's first bitter taste of arbitrary power. This was the terrain. My home, my family, under siege by a tyrant whose only weapon was the HOA charter, wielded like a scepter. I had dealt with worse. Much worse. Men who lied under oath, corporations that bled communities dry, systems designed to crush the individual. Brenda was small fry, or so I thought. The warnings escalated. A notice about the precise angle of our mailbox. Apparently, it listed 2 degrees to the port side of righteousness. Another about the unapproved shade of our welcome mat. Each one delivered with a smirk that hinted at a deeper, more personal vendetta. I reviewed the HOA documents, a tedious exercise in Byzantine regulations. They were poorly drafted, full of loopholes a first-year law student could drive a truck through. But Brenda operated on intimidation, not legal acumen. Most residents just paid the fines, replaced the mats, trimmed the grass with religious fervor. Easier than fighting. Easier than Brenda. My initial strategy was appeasement, a bitter pill. We adjusted the mailbox. We bought a beige mat. The grass was shorn to within an inch of its life, a temporary truce, I hoped. A miscalculation. Appeasement only fed the beast. The calls started. Anonymous complaints to animal control about our golden retriever, Gus, a creature whose only sin was excessive friendliness. Each time, a polite officer would show up, pat Gus on the head, and leave, apologizing for the inconvenience. Someone in the neighborhood, they'd say, eyes flicking towards Brenda's meticulously curated rose bushes. The pressure was constant, a low hum of harassment designed to grind us down. It was personal, intensely so. Brenda craved control, and our quiet contentment, our refusal to engage in her petty dramas, seemed to infuriate her. She wanted a reaction, a capitulation. She wanted us to break. I'm a patient man. I've sat through days of depositions, listening to perjurers weave intricate webs of deceit. I've cross-examined witnesses until their composure cracked, revealing the ugly truth beneath. Patience is a weapon. But patience has its limits, especially when your family is in the crosshairs. The turning point, the moment the cold-blooded calm began to curdle into something else, was subtle. A casual comment from Brenda during a forced neighborhood barbecue. "Such a large lot you have, dear," she'd said to Sarah, her eyes sweeping over our backyard, lingering on the undeveloped patch near the old oak tree. Lots of potential there. For the community, of course. The community being Brenda, naturally. There was a glint in her eye, something predatory. It wasn't about the grass anymore. It was never just about the grass. It was about the land, my land. The discovery was almost accidental, a byproduct of Lily's fascination with digging. She'd been excavating near the old oak, a self-proclaimed paleontologist searching for dinosaur bones. when her little plastic shovel hit something that wasn't dirt or rock. She ran in, hands covered in a thick, black, viscous substance, shouting, "Daddy, I found treasure! Sticky treasure!" I followed her out, expecting mud, maybe some buried refuse from previous owners. But the smell hit me first. Acrid, unmistakable, crude. Not a lot, just a seep, oozing from a fissure in the clay soil she'd exposed. My mind, conditioned by years of sifting through complex evidence, started to connect dots I hadn't even realized were there. The unusual persistence of Brenda's focus on our property line, her pointed remarks about the underutilized portion of our yard, the way her gaze always drifted to that specific area. It wasn't just general malice, it was targeted. I cleaned Lily up, told her she'd found some special earth, and quietly cordoned off the area. That night, after Sarah and Lily were asleep, I went back out with a flashlight and a trowel. The seep was small but definite. I took samples, sealed them in sterile jars. The implications were staggering. This was suburbia, not West Texas. Oil here? It seemed preposterous. But the evidence was slick and pungent on my gloved hands. My first call wasn't to a geologist, but to Marcus Thorne, Gizmo, to those who valued discretion and unparalleled digital forensics. He owed me more than one. "Gizmo," I said, my voice low. "I need a discreet geological survey, and I mean discreet, as in it never happened." He didn't ask questions. That was Gizmo's virtue. "Coordinates?" I sent them. "Give me 48 hours and plausible deniability." The next 2 days were a masterclass in feigned normalcy. I mowed the lawn to Brenda's exacting standards. I smiled benignly as she critiqued the spacing of my azaleas. Inside, a different kind of machinery was whirring to life. My legal mind, the one I usually reserve for dismantling corporate malfeasance or federal statutes, was now focused on HOA bylaws and property rights with the intensity of a laser. The survey results came via encrypted email. Gizmo's analysis was concise. Significant, shallow reservoir. Light, sweet crude. You're sitting on a goddamn gold mine, counselor. Or black gold, anyway. Enough to make a certain kind of person lose their damn mind. He also included satellite imagery from the past 6 months. Subtle, almost imperceptible changes in vegetation patterns near the oak tree on my property. And, more interestingly, on the edge of the common area bordering my land. Someone had been poking around. Not just Lily. The timing of Brenda's escalating harassment suddenly snapped into sharp, ugly focus. She knew. Or suspected. How? A stray comment from a landscaper? A lucky guess? Or had she commissioned her own, less discreet survey? The thought sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't about a power trip anymore. This was about greed, raw and undisguised. Millions, potentially tens of millions, lay beneath my daughter's makeshift dinosaur dig. And Brenda Henderson, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, wanted it. The community, she'd call it. Her community. The HOA charter, that poorly drafted mess, suddenly became her most potent weapon. I reread it, this time not for loopholes, but for vulnerabilities. Mine. There were clauses about common resources and land use benefiting the collective. Vague enough to be twisted, contorted by someone with enough audacity and a pliant board. And Brenda had both. She had cultivated her board, a collection of sycophants and apathetic retirees, with the same meticulous care she lavished on her prize-winning roses. They'd rubber stamp whatever she put in front of them. The next notice wasn't about grass. It was a formal letter, typed on official HOA letterhead, citing a hitherto unknown addendum to the bylaws regarding geological assessments of community assets. It demanded access to my property for exploratory surveying. The gall was breathtaking. The precision was chilling. They were moving fast. My blood ran cold, then hot. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was attempted theft, cloaked in the flimsy disguise of community interest. This was a moral violation that resonated deep in my bones, a primal transgression against hearth and home. They were coming for my land, my family's security, my daughter's future. They had just declared war, and they had no idea who they were fighting. The letter, with its pseudo-legal jargon and arrogant demands, lay on my desk like a venomous snake. Exploratory surveying, community assets. The audacity was monumental, the kind of brazen overreach that often precedes a spectacular fall. Brenda Henderson, in her boundless avarice, had just crossed a line etched not in HOA bylaws, but in fundamental principles of law and decency. She hadn't just poked the bear. She'd tried to steal its cave while it was still hibernating. A mistake. A fatal one. I stared at the signature, a flamboyant scrawl of self-importance. Brenda Henderson, President. President of nothing but a glorified neighborhood watch with delusions of sovereign power. But delusions, when backed by manipulated rules and a compliant board, could inflict real damage. This was no longer a skirmish over lawn aesthetics. This was a calculated attempt at expropriation, a land grab dressed in the cheap suit of community benefit. The oil. It had to be the oil. Her earlier, almost casual surveillance of my property, her pointed questions, the sudden escalation from petty grievances to demands for access, it all clicked into place with the cold, hard snap of a well-oiled mechanism. She knew, or she suspected strongly enough to gamble. The thought of her, this self-important little tyrant, scheming to siphon away a resource that rightfully belonged to my family, that could secure Lily's future, ignited a fury within me, cold and precise. It wasn't the incandescent rage of a bar fight. It was the glacial anger of a calculating mind pushed beyond its limits. This wasn't just an attack on my property. It was an attack on my intelligence, on my capacity to protect what was mine. They thought I was just another suburban dad, easily cowed by official-looking stationery and the threat of social ostracism. They didn't know the corridors of power I walked, the real wolves I'd faced down in federal courtrooms. They didn't know that my quiet demeanor was a carefully constructed facade, a habit born of necessity, in a profession where emotional outbursts were liabilities. They didn't know I was a federal prosecutor, specialized in complex white-collar crime and public corruption. My world was one of sealed indictments, intricate financial trails, and the dismantling of criminal enterprises far more sophisticated than Brenda Henderson's petty fiefdom. But the principles were the same: abuse of power, fraud, conspiracy. Brenda was playing in a league far above her pay grade, and she was about to learn the rules the hard way. "They crossed the line, Sarah," I said later that evening, my voice devoid of its usual warmth. I handed her the letter. She read it, her face paling. "They can't do this, can they?" she whispered, the fear in her eyes stealing my resolve. "They think they can," I replied. "They're about to discover they're mistaken." The moral violation was absolute. It wasn't just about the potential wealth. It was about the sanctity of home, the right to be secure in one's own property, free from the predatory machinations of a petty despot. Brenda had mistaken my patience for weakness, my desire for a quiet life for acquiescence. She had triggered something dormant, something I usually kept leashed. The warrior, reluctant but now fully awake. The fight wouldn't be with shovels and threats shouted across a fence line. It would be fought on my turf, the law. It would be precise, methodical, and devastating. My mind began to catalog the necessary steps, a mental checklist forming with crystalline clarity. Document everything. Analyze their every move. Identify their weaknesses, their accomplices. Build the case. The HOA charter, their supposed source of authority, would become their indictment. Their procedural errors, their overreach, their transparent greed, all would be laid bare. The blood in this conflict wouldn't be literal, but the moral cost to them would be immense. The fence around my property, once a simple boundary, now felt like the rampart of a besieged fortress. But they had made a critical error. They had besieged a fortress commanded by someone who knew how to turn the tables, to transform a defense into a devastating counteroffensive. The porch light, usually a welcoming beacon, now seemed like a watchtower, its glow a silent promise of vigilance. They wanted my land? They would find themselves losing everything they thought they controlled. The shift was internal, profound. The suburban dad persona receded, replaced by the prosecutor, the strategist, the man who had stared down hardened criminals and corrupt officials without flinching. Brenda Henderson thought she was dealing with a neighbor. She was about to meet the federal government, in spirit if not yet in official capacity, and the reckoning would be absolute. The first step in any engagement is reconnaissance. Know your enemy. Know their terrain. Brenda's terrain was the HOA, her weapon, its bylaws, her army, the pliant board members. My initial foray was quiet, digital. I pulled every publicly available document related to the Whispering Pines HOA. Articles of incorporation, minutes from past meetings, surprisingly detailed. Thanks to a secretary with a penchant for verbatim transcription, financial statements, and every version of the bylaws and their amendments. It was a monument to bureaucratic overreach and sloppy drafting, a veritable goldmine of procedural vulnerabilities. While I immersed myself in the HOA's paper trail, Gizmo was tasked with a different kind of intelligence gathering. Brenda Henderson, I'd told him, full spectrum. Financials, connections, any unusual patterns. And the board members. See who's really pulling the strings, or whose strings are being pulled. His response was a curt, "Consider it done." "You focusing on the legal angle?" "Among other things," I replied. My family became my emotional anchor. The reason this fight was not just necessary, but righteous. Lily, oblivious to the storm gathering, still asked about her sticky treasure. Sarah, though worried, trusted my judgment, her quiet support a bedrock. Her fear was a constant reminder of what was at stake. The HOA meetings, once an exercise in tedious local politics I'd assiduously avoided, became a key source of intel. I started attending, a silent observer in the back row. Brenda, perched at the head table like a low-budget monarch, reveled in her authority. She'd preen, she'd dictate, she'd shut down any dissenting voice with a sharp rap of her gavel or a withering glare. The other residents, the silent majority, mostly kept their heads down. Years of Brenda's tyranny had conditioned them into passivity. They were cannon fodder for her ambitions. And now, potentially, for mine. I noted their discontent, the subtle eye rolls, the hushed, frustrated whispers as they exited. They were a resource, currently untapped. One evening, after a particularly galling meeting where Brenda railroaded through a special assessment for landscaping beautification that suspiciously focused on common areas abutting my property, I saw my opening. Old Mr. Abernathy, a retired engineer whose prize-winning petunias had once run afoul of Brenda's aesthetic sensibilities, was muttering darkly to himself. "She's out of control," he grumbled loud enough for me to overhear. I approached him. "Mr. Abernathy," I said quietly. "She is, and I think it's time someone reined her in." His eyes, usually clouded with resignation, sharpened. "What are you proposing, son?" "For now," I said, "just observation, and perhaps a little shared information." This was the beginning of my rebellion fodder recruitment. Small conversations, shared grievances, planting seeds of doubt about Brenda's omnipotence. Gizmo's preliminary report on Brenda was illuminating. No direct evidence of bribery yet, but a lifestyle that seemed to exceed her visible means of support. Her husband was a mid-level accountant, hardly a titan of industry. Frequent trips, expensive hobbies, a network of local contractors who seemed to get all the HOA business, often at inflated prices. The board members were a mix. Two were clearly in her pocket, echoing her every pronouncement. One was elderly and easily confused. The last, a nervous newcomer named David Chen, seemed perpetually uncomfortable. Chen was my potential weak link. The exploratory surveying letter was still on my desk, a ticking clock. I hadn't responded formally yet. My silence was a tactic. Let them wonder. Let them grow overconfident. Instead, I focused on the HOA's own rules. The demand for access cited an addendum. I found no record of this addendum being properly voted on, or even officially circulated to homeowners, as required by the HOA's own charter. Procedural error number 1. A big one. The visual of documents piling up, highlighted and annotated, became a motif in my late-night work. Blueprints of my property overlaid with Gizmo's geological data, financial spreadsheets, meeting minutes, each piece of paper, a weapon in the arsenal I was assembling. The fight wouldn't be quick, but it would be thorough. They didn't know I was a federal lawyer status was my ace in the hole, a hidden authority that informed every decision, every meticulously planned step. My approach was that of a tactical operation: gather intelligence, identify targets, secure assets, neutralize threats. Brenda Henderson and her cronies were about to find out what happens when you try to take a predator's kill. The calm before the storm was almost palpable. Brenda, likely interpreting my silence as fear or indecision, grew bolder. Another letter arrived, this one more peremptory, setting a deadline for my compliance. The deadpan sarcasm I longed to unleash would have to wait. For now, surgical precision was required. Phase 1, reconnaissance, was nearing completion. Phase 2, tactical retaliation, was about to begin. The deadline on Brenda's second letter passed. My response was not the capitulation she expected, but a meticulously crafted cease and desist delivered by certified mail and, for good measure, emailed to every board member. It was a thing of legal beauty, cold, precise, and utterly uncompromising. It detailed, with surgical precision, the HOA's procedural failings regarding the alleged addendum, the lack of proper notification, the violation of due process, and the potential tortious interference with my quiet enjoyment of my property. It concluded with a demand that they immediately retract their unlawful request for access and halt all further actions aimed at my land, hinting at substantial legal repercussions, including personal liability for board members, should they persist. I copied my personal attorney, a pit bull named Eleanor Vance, whose reputation in civil litigation was legendary. Eleanor wasn't just a legal ally, she was a force of nature. Her name on the CC line was a shot across their bow. The effect was immediate. The HOA's usual bluster faltered. I imagined Brenda's face, contorted in fury and perhaps a dawning sliver of apprehension as she read it. Gizmo, who had managed to get a discreet tap on publicly available information about HOA communications, nothing illegal, just clever aggregation of what was already out there, reported a flurry of panicked emails between board members. David Chen, the nervous newcomer, apparently tried to raise concerns about the legal letter at an emergency board meeting Brenda convened. He was promptly shut down. But the seed of dissent was sown. My inner monologue during this phase was a constant stream of tactical assessments. Brenda will double down, narcissists always do. The two loyalists will support her. The confused one will dither. Chen is the pressure point. The next move from the HOA was predictable. A letter from their lawyer. A local guy, clearly out of his depth, relying on boilerplate arguments about the HOA's broad powers. It was weak, full of bluster, and devoid of substantive legal merit. Eleanor eviscerated it in a response that was both scathing and dismissive. Her prose had the cutting edge of a scalpel. "Your client," she wrote, "appears to be operating under the misapprehension that the Whispering Pines HOA is a sovereign entity, immune from the laws of this state and the United States Constitution. Allow me to disabuse you of this notion." The deadpan sarcasm was exquisite. This was where the humor, dark and situational, began to surface. The absurdity of this suburban squabble escalating to threats of federal lawsuits was not lost on me, but the stakes, the oil, my family's security, were deadly serious. While Eleanor handled the direct legal jousting, I focused on broadening the front. I drafted a formal complaint to the state agency overseeing HOAs, detailing Brenda's abuses of power, the lack of transparency, and the financial irregularities Gizmo was steadily uncovering. Gizmo's work was masterful. He found a pattern of no-bid contracts awarded to companies owned by Brenda's brother-in-law. Inflated invoices for landscaping and maintenance that corresponded with her expensive vacations. It wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about systemic corruption. The local corruption ties were beginning to emerge, albeit on a small, grubby scale. The visual of a drone surveillance overlay on my property, showing the disputed boundary and the common areas Brenda was trying to claim, became a recurring image in my mind as I prepared my case. The fence, that symbol of defiance, was holding. For now, my interactions with neighbors intensified. I shared discreetly at first copies of the HOA's threatening letters and my concise, factual rebuttals. Mr. Abernathy became an invaluable ally, his decades in the neighborhood giving him a network of disgruntled homeowners. "She fined Mrs. Peterson for a wind chime, you know," he told me, his voice laced with indignation. "Said it violated noise ordinances. That wind chime was a gift from her late husband." Stories like these fueled the growing rebellion. The silent majority was finding its voice. They saw someone fighting back, not with angry outbursts, but with calm, irrefutable logic. My military background, though not something I advertised, informed my strategy. Control the narrative, secure your lines of communication, exploit the enemy's weaknesses. Brenda's primary weakness was her arrogance and her underestimation of her opponent. She was used to dealing with amateurs. She was now facing a professional. The status reveal twist wasn't a dramatic public announcement, but a slow, dawning realization among the HOA leadership that they were outmatched. The legal filings, the precision of the arguments, the unwavering resolve, it began to penetrate even Brenda's thick skull. But she was too invested, too greedy, to back down easily. The oil was a siren song, luring her onto the rocks. The next step was to escalate the pressure on the board members personally. Eleanor drafted individual letters to each of them, outlining their fiduciary duties and their potential personal liability for Brenda's reckless actions. This was tactical. Aim for the weakest links. David Chen called me, his voice trembling. I didn't know it'd get like this," he stammered. "I just wanted to help the neighborhood." "Then help it, Mr. Chen," I said, my voice cold but not unkind. "Stop her, before you all end up in a courtroom, explaining why you tried to steal a man's land and defraud your neighbors." The call ended. The hook was set. The pressure campaign on the board members began to yield results, not in a sudden mutiny, but in subtle shifts of allegiance. David Chen, after our call, started asking pointed questions in board meetings, Gizmo reported. Questions about legal fees, about the wisdom of pursuing this fight against a homeowner who clearly knew the law. He was still outvoted by Brenda's loyalists, but his dissent was recorded in the minutes, a small crack in their unified front. The true leverage, however, lay in the financial irregularities Gizmo had unearthed. The no-bid contracts, the inflated invoices, the curious correlation between HOA expenditures and Brenda's personal enrichment. It was a classic case of self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty. It was time to weaponize this information. I compiled a dossier, a meticulously organized collection of bank statements, invoices, emails procured by Gizmo through entirely legal means, focusing on public records and metadata from HOA communications he'd been monitoring after the initial public disclosures, and comparative quotes from other contractors showing massive overcharges. It painted a damning picture of Brenda Henderson not as a diligent community leader, but as a grifter, systematically looting the HOA coffers. This wasn't just about my oil-rich land anymore. It was about every dollar she'd siphoned from her neighbors. This was the local corruption ties exposed through documents phase, unfolding with methodical precision. My next step was a formal demand for a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances, sent to each board member and the HOA's hapless attorney. The demand cited specific discrepancies and irregularities, backed by Gizmo's evidence. It also invoked a rarely used clause in the HOA bylaws that allowed homeowners to petition for such an audit if sufficient cause was shown. I had more than sufficient cause. The reaction was explosive. Brenda, according to Gizmo's intel on the digital chatter, went ballistic. She accused me of harassment, of trying to destroy the community. Her two loyalist board members parroted her outrage. But David Chen, emboldened, argued for the audit. Even the elderly, confused board member seemed to grasp that something was seriously amiss. "All that money for mulch?" she reportedly asked. "My son gets mulch for half that price." The deadpan irony of it was almost beautiful. While the board imploded, I continued to cultivate my support among the other homeowners. I held a quiet meeting at my house, not to plot a coup, but to share information. I presented a sanitized version of the financial irregularities, focusing on the impact to their wallets, This isn't just about my property, I explained, my voice calm, reasonable. This is about how our HOA fees are being managed, or mismanaged. The sight of canceled checks to companies owned by Brenda's relatives, juxtaposed against quotes for the same services at half the price, had a profound effect. The silent majority was becoming a vocal, angry chorus. Mr. Abernathy, bless his cantankerous heart, proposed a petition to recall Brenda and the entire board. The idea gained traction with surprising speed. The legal battle over access to my land continued in parallel, Eleanor expertly parrying every clumsy thrust from the HOA's lawyer. We filed a counterclaim for harassment and abuse of process, seeking damages. The message was clear. We would not only defend, we would attack. The on-screen text visual of legal filings, violation notices now going the other way, and highlighted financial statements would have been thick on the screen in any cinematic adaptation. Zoom-ins on incriminating signatures, on dates that didn't add up. My inner monologue became a running commentary on the unfolding campaign. Brenda's cornered. She'll lash out. The loyalists are exposed. Chen is wavering. The residents are mobilized. It was a multi-front war, and we were advancing on all of them. The stress was immense, but it was a familiar kind of stress. The pressure of a high-stakes case reaching its critical phase. Sarah was a rock, managing the home front, shielding Lily from the worst of it, her quiet strength a constant source of renewal for me. She understood the necessity of this fight, the moral imperative. "You're doing what's right," she'd say, her hand on my arm, a simple gesture that conveyed a world of support. The surprise reversal was already in motion, though Brenda couldn't see it. She thought she was the hunter. She was, in fact, the prey, slowly being driven into a trap of her own making. Her greed, her arrogance, her petty tyranny, these were the tools of her own destruction. The oil under my land was merely the catalyst, the spark that ignited the dry tinder of her corruption. The climax was approaching, not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, yet, but in the slow, inexorable collapse of her power base. The audit demand, backed by the threat of legal action and a growing homeowner revolt, was the key. She could try to block it, but that would only confirm her guilt. She was caught. The demand for an independent audit sent shockwaves through the Whispering Pines HOA. Brenda, true to form, tried to stonewall. She convened an emergency board meeting, presumably to quash the request, but she underestimated the groundswell of discontent. David Chen, no longer a nervous newcomer but a reluctant rebel armed with facts, openly challenged her. He wasn't alone. Gizmo's intelligence network, now encompassing a few well-placed, disgruntled neighbors, reported that Mr. Abernathy and a delegation of homeowners showed up at the meeting, uninvited but unyielding, armed with their petition for recall and copies of my audit demand. The visual of this scene. Brenda, flushed and sputtering, facing a roomful of stony-faced residents, would have been cinematic gold. The dramatic lighting change would be palpable as her authority visibly crumbled. The HOA's lawyer, looking increasingly beleaguered, advised the board that refusing a properly petitioned audit could have severe legal consequences, especially given the evidence of irregularities already presented. The two loyalist board members, seeing the tide turn and perhaps fearing personal liability, began to waver. Their support for Brenda became noticeably less enthusiastic. My strategy was working. The relentless pressure, the meticulous documentation, the mobilization of the community. It was a coordinated assault on her crumbling empire. I remained publicly aloof from the HOA meeting drama, letting the residents carry the torch. My role was the architect of her downfall, not the executioner. That role, it seemed, would be filled by her own neighbors. The board, fractured and under immense pressure, buckled. They voted to authorize the independent audit. It was a devastating blow to Brenda. Her control was shattered. The audit firm selected was reputable, with a forensic accounting department known for its rigor. I supplied them with Gizmo's preliminary findings, a roadmap to Brenda's financial labyrinth. While the auditors began their painstaking work, the recall petition gained enough signatures to force a special election. Brenda's reign was effectively over. Though she clung to the title of president like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood, the legal skirmish over my land also took a decisive turn. Faced with our counterclaim, the mounting evidence of HOA misconduct, and the internal collapse of the board's unity, the HOA's lawyer advised them to seek a settlement. Eleanor, in her element, was brutal in her negotiations. There would be no quiet dismissal. The HOA would issue a formal public apology for the harassment and the baseless claims against my property. They would retract all notices and demands. They would cover all my legal fees. And, crucially, they would agree to a permanent injunction preventing any future attempts by the HOA or its agents to claim any interest in or demand access to my land for any purpose related to subterranean resources. My oil was secure. The arrest warrant or news headline on-screen text wasn't quite there yet, but the feeling of impending justice was thick in the air. Brenda's personal reckoning was still to come, tied to the results of the audit. The tactical ops metaphor for legal strategy had played out. We had identified the objective, secure the land, neutralize the threat, gathered intel, established a beachhead, legal defense, and launched a counteroffensive financial investigation, community mobilization that routed the enemy. My inner monologue was one of grim satisfaction. Target neutralized. Mission objectives achieved. Collateral damage to the enemy extensive. The climax wasn't a single explosive confrontation with me, but a series of defeats for Brenda, culminating in her public humiliation. The special recall election was a formality. Brenda didn't even bother to campaign. She and her 2 loyalist board members were overwhelmingly voted out. David Chen, surprisingly, was elected as the new HOA president, running on a platform of transparency and reform. He called me the day after the election. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice sincere. "And my thanks. You showed us we didn't have to live under that kind of rule." "Just do the right thing, Mr. Chen," I replied. "That's all anyone asks." The transition was swift. The new board, under Chen's leadership, cooperated fully with the auditors. The atmosphere in Whispering Pines began to change. The fear dissipated, replaced by a tentative sense of empowerment among the residents. They had faced down a tyrant and won. The climactic confrontation was in a way diffuse, spread across multiple victories, but the public embarrassment of Brenda was total and undeniable. She became a pariah in the neighborhood she once lorded over. The independent audit report landed like a bombshell, though for me and Gizmo, its contents were largely anticipated. It detailed years of systematic embezzlement, fraudulent invoicing, and blatant self-dealing by Brenda Henderson, often with the knowing or negligent complicity of her closest board allies. The total sum misappropriated was staggering for a suburban HOA running well into 6 figures. The auditors recommended referring the matter to law enforcement for criminal investigation. David Chen, as the new HOA president, had the unenviable task of presenting these findings to the community at a specially convened meeting. I attended not as a participant, but as an observer, sitting quietly in the back. Sarah was beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine. Lily was at home with a sitter, blissfully unaware of the adult dramas her sticky treasure had inadvertently uncorked. The meeting was somber. Chen, to his credit, handled it with gravity and transparency. He laid out the facts, unvarnished and damning. The residents listened in stunned silence, punctuated by occasional gasps or muttered curses. Brenda was not present. She had, according to neighborhood gossip, become a recluse, rarely seen outside her home. The public reckoning was unfolding, even in her absence. Her reputation was in ashes. The on-screen text of a local news headline about the HOA scandal flashed in my mind's eye. Following the meeting, the new HOA board, on the advice of their legal counsel, a new firm, carefully vetted, voted unanimously to turn over the audit report and all supporting documentation to the district attorney's office. My involvement was now officially concluded, my objectives met. The land was secure, the oil rights unequivocally mine. The HOA was on a path to reform. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, was being served. The law enforcement or legal ally in this final phase was the DA's office, an impersonal entity, but one I knew well from my professional life. I had no doubt they would pursue the case with vigor, given the clarity of the evidence. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the system, for all its flaws, could still deliver accountability when properly engaged. The emotional tone was one of somber resilience, of righteous fury transmuted into cold, calculated vengeance, now giving way to a weary sense of closure. The fight had taken its toll, mentally and emotionally, but it had been necessary. The visual metaphor of the locked gate resonated deeply. Not just the physical gate to my property, but a psychological one, closing on this chapter of conflict. The porch light, once a symbol of vigilance, now felt like a return to normalcy, a beacon of quiet domesticity reclaimed. My family's legacy, tied now to this unexpected bounty from the earth, was secure. The oil, a source of so much potential strife, would instead become a foundation for Lily's future, for our family's security, a testament to the fight we had waged and won. The symbolic revenge was complete, not just in defeating Brenda, but in ensuring that the very thing she tried to steal would now benefit the family she had targeted. There was no gloating, no triumph, just a profound sense of justice, delivered with surgical precision. The surprise reversal, that the unassuming suburban dad was a formidable legal warrior planning every step, had played out perfectly. They hadn't known who I was. Now, the entire neighborhood, and soon perhaps the wider community, would know what Brenda Henderson was. In the weeks that followed, life in Whispering Pines began to return to a new normal. The HOA, under Chen's stewardship, started to function as it was intended, a genuine community association, not a personal fiefdom. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. Neighbors started talking to each other again, planting flowers without fear of reprisal, their wind chimes tinkling freely in the breeze. The blood in this war had been metaphorical, reputation shredded, power dismantled, illusions shattered. The moral cost of Brenda's actions was her complete undoing. My intensely personal battle had, in the end, liberated an entire community. The weaponized narration I had employed in my legal filings and strategic communications now softened into the quiet cadence of my inner thoughts, the tactical mind receding as the husband and father came back to the fore. The final visual cue. A quiet evening on our porch, Sarah beside me, Lily chasing fireflies in the yard near the old oak tree. The land was peaceful, ours. The fight was over. The dust didn't settle quickly. The DA's office, armed with the audit and the HOA's formal complaint, launched a thorough investigation into Brenda Henderson and her cronies. Subpoenas were issued. Bank records were scrutinized. Former contractors, sensing immunity in exchange for cooperation, began to talk. It was a slow, grinding process, the wheels of justice turning with deliberate, inexorable force. Gizmo kept me updated, his digital tendrils reaching into the public record, plucking out tidbits of information. "They're interviewing her brother-in-law next week," he'd report. Or, "Looks like they found an offshore account. Counselor, amateur hour." His deadpan sarcasm was a welcome counterpoint to the grim reality of the unfolding legal drama. My life, however, began to detach from the HOA's turmoil. My focus shifted back to my federal cases, to the complex dance of prosecution and defense that defined my professional world. Yet, the experience with Brenda had left an indelible mark. It was a stark reminder that tyranny and corruption weren't confined to corporate boardrooms or government offices. They could fester anywhere, even in the manicured lawns of suburbia. The moral unflinchingness required to see the fight through had been draining, but also clarifying. There are lines that, once crossed, demand a response, not of equal pettiness, but of overwhelming, decisive force, applied within the bounds of the law. My legal strategy had been a tactical operation, and the enemy had been thoroughly routed. The intensely personal nature of the initial provocation, the attacks on my home, the threat to my family, had fueled the cold-blooded calm of my response. Emotion channeled, not suppressed, into focused action. One afternoon, months later, David Chen stopped by. He looked less stressed, more confident than I'd ever seen him. "The DA is planning to file charges," he said, his voice quiet. "Grand larceny, embezzlement, conspiracy, against Brenda and 2 of the old board members." He paused. "Thank you. None of this would have happened without you." I nodded. "You're doing a good job, David. Keep the HOA clean, that's thanks enough." The news of the impending indictment spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. There was no celebration, more a sense of grim validation. The public reckoning was entering its final official phase. The legal revenge thriller had reached its denouement. My family was the ultimate justification for the entire ordeal. Lily was already planning what she'd do with her college fund from the sticky treasure, as she called it. We'd consulted with geologists and responsible drilling companies, ensuring that any extraction of the oil would be done with minimal environmental impact and maximum benefit to our family's long-term security. It was a responsibility I took seriously. The symbolic revenge wasn't just about Brenda's downfall, but about transforming her greed into a force for good, at least for my own. The supporting characters had played their parts. Sarah, my emotional anchor. Gizmo, my tech-savvy sidekick, instrumental in the escalation. Mr. Abernathy and the neighbors, the rebellion fodder, turned agents of change. And even David Chen, the reluctant authority figure who ultimately helped legitimize the ousting. The narrative structure, from petty harassment to moral violation, tactical retaliation, and finally public reckoning, had completed its arc. The first-person, omniscient feeling POV, driven by my planning and Gizmo's surveillance, had allowed the story to unfold with a sense of inevitable, unfolding justice. The language, precise and weaponized during the conflict, now settled into a more reflective tone. The military or legal jargon, once tools of the trade, were now just memories of the battle fought. The short declarative sentences that marked my control during the campaign gave way to a more flowing, contemplative style in my inner monologue. The power paragraphs that built momentum were no longer needed. The emotional undercurrents, once explosive, had found their resolution. The cold, calculated vengeance had achieved its purpose, leaving behind not a void, but a space for peace and a renewed appreciation for the sanctity of home. The fence around our property still stood, a visual metaphor for boundaries respected, for defiance rewarded. The porch light still burned, a symbol of control regained, of a haven protected. The locked gate, both literal and psychological, signified closure. The story was a testament to the idea that, even in the quietest corners of life, battles for justice must sometimes be fought, and that a reluctant warrior, armed with skill, determination, and moral authority, can prevail against even the most insidious forms of tyranny. They really didn't know who I was, and now they never would again. The indictments came down on a Tuesday. Brenda Henderson, her 2 most loyal board members, and her brother-in-law, the contractor who had benefited so richly from her largesse. The charges were extensive, multiple counts of grand larceny, embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud. The local news picked up the story. A minor scandal in the grand scheme of things, but a seismic event for Whispering Pines. Former HOA president indicted in embezzlement scheme. The headline was stark, impersonal. It didn't capture the years of petty tyranny, the emotional cost to the residents, or the sheer audacity of her attempt to steal my land, but it was a public branding, a formal declaration of her disgrace. Gizmo sent me the link with a single comment. Checkmate. I didn't attend any of the court proceedings. My part was done. The evidence I had helped unearth, the audit I had forced, these were the foundations of the prosecution's case. The legal system, slow and imperfect as it often is, was now grinding towards its inevitable conclusion. David Chen and the new HOA board worked with the DA to seek restitution for the stolen funds. It would be a long process, but the commitment to recovering what was lost was a testament to the neighborhood's newfound resolve. The oil under my land remained a quiet promise. We engaged a small, reputable firm to conduct further, more detailed assessments. The initial estimates were confirmed, a significant, viable reserve. The plans for extraction were slow, careful, environmentally conscious. This wasn't a windfall to be squandered, but a legacy to be managed responsibly. It was, in a strange way, a gift born from conflict, a silver lining to the dark cloud of Brenda's greed. The tactical justice fantasy had played out in the real world with real consequences. My hidden or dormant authority as a federal lawyer had been the crucial, unseen weapon. Brenda, the HOA president with exaggerated control issues, narcissistic and delusional, had become a case study in the corrupting influence of unchecked minor power. Her downfall was a direct result of her own hubris. The supporting cast had faded back into their everyday lives, changed by the experience. Mr. Abernathy's petunias were more vibrant than ever. Mrs. Peterson's wind chimes sang freely. The silent majority was no longer silent. They had learned the power of collective action, the importance of vigilance. My intensely personal journey from reluctant warrior to architect of a neighborhood liberation was complete. The legally lethal tone of my counteroffensive had given way to a morally unflinching peace. The dramatic with surgical precision approach had yielded the desired outcome. The deadpan sarcasm had been a necessary release valve, a way to maintain sanity in the face of absurdity. The cold-blooded calm with explosive emotional undercurrents had defined my internal state throughout the conflict. Now, the undercurrents were placid. The final resolution for Brenda and her associates would come in a courtroom, with sentences handed down by a judge. But for me, the resolution had already occurred. It was in the quiet evenings on my porch, the sound of Lily's laughter, the knowledge that my family was safe, our future secure. It was in the restored peace of the neighborhood. The first-person linear escalation had run its course. Petty harassment had led to moral violation, which had triggered tactical retaliation, culminating in a public reckoning. The story had been told, not just in words, but in actions, in consequences. The rhetorical flourishes to punctuate justice were now just echoes. The primary lesson, if there was one, was about the corrosive nature of unchecked power, however small the stage, and the enduring strength of standing up to it, not with rage, but with reason, resolve, and a deep, unwavering commitment to what is right. My direct address to an imagined audience, the "you won't believe what happened" framing, was now a silent acknowledgement that some stories, however personal, resonate with universal truths about human nature, about conflict, and about the enduring pursuit of justice. The suburban horror had indeed turned into a war zone, albeit one fought with legal briefs and financial audits rather than bullets. And the military mind versus HOA tyranny had seen the military mind prevail, not through force of arms, but through superior strategy and unwavering moral conviction. The opera was over. The curtain had fallen. The trials concluded nearly a year later. Brenda Henderson was found guilty on multiple counts. Her tearful plea for leniency, citing community service and her love for Whispering Pines, fell on deaf ears. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fairness and severity in cases of public trust violation, sentenced her to a significant prison term. Her two bored cronies received lesser sentences, and her brother-in-law faced fines and probation after cooperating fully. Restitution was ordered, though it would take years, if ever, for the HOA to recover the full amount. Justice, in its tangible, punitive form, had been served. The news sent a final, quiet ripple through the neighborhood. There was no celebration, just a collective sigh of relief, a closing of a painful chapter. David Chen continued to lead the HOA with a steady hand, implementing new transparency measures and fostering a genuine sense of community that Brenda's reign had nearly extinguished. My family thrived. Lily, older now, understood a little more about the sticky treasure and the bad lady who tried to take it. The oil revenue, managed prudently, was indeed securing her future, providing opportunities we might only have dreamed of before. But more valuable than the money was the lesson implicitly learned, that integrity and courage matter, that bullies can be faced down, that justice, even when slow, is worth fighting for. The symbolic revenge tied to family legacy found its true meaning not in the wealth, but in the values upheld. My reluctant warrior archetype had receded. The dormant authority had been exercised, and now lay at rest again, though forever changed, more readily accessible should the need ever arise. The experience had honed it, sharpened its edges. The memory of Brenda's petty harassment, her escalating moral violations, my tactical retaliation, and her ultimate public reckoning served as a stark reminder. Never underestimate the lengths to which greed can drive someone, and never underestimate your own capacity to fight back when pushed too far. The narrative, my first-person retaliation opera, had played out to its final resonant chord. The visual metaphors had all found their real-world counterparts. The fence, a steadfast boundary; the porch light, a beacon of reclaimed peace; the locked gate, a symbol of definitive closure. The blood, the moral cost, had been entirely on the antagonist's side. My role as a federal lawyer, the status-revealed twist that had been my unspoken advantage, remained largely unknown to the wider neighborhood. Only a few key people, Gizmo, Eleanor, David Chen, knew the full extent of my professional capabilities and how they had been deployed, and that was how I preferred it. My actions were not for acclaim, but for the protection of my family and the restoration of basic decency. The terse, cold, tactical dialogue and monologue, heavy with strategic inner commentary that characterized the height of the conflict, had softened. Now, my inner voice was quieter, more reflective. The dark situational irony and dry deadpan wit that had surfaced during the absurdity of it all still brought a wry smile to my face in quiet moments. The relentless and cinematic pacing of events had slowed to the rhythm of everyday life. The short declarative sentences for control and power paragraphs for momentum were no longer needed. My precise, weaponized narration had served its purpose. The emotionally restrained but poetic when cathartic moments had found their catharsis. The slow-burning moral authority had prevailed. Whispering Pines was, in the end, just a neighborhood. But it had been a battlefield. And on that field, a victory had been won, not just for one family, but for the principle that no one, not even an HOA president with delusions of grandeur, is above the law or beyond accountability. The oil continued to be a quiet blessing, a reminder of the strange twists life can take, and I, the federal lawyer who just wanted a peaceful suburban life, went back to fighting different kinds of battles, armed with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down tyranny in his own backyard and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably victorious. The experience was a crucible, forging a resilience and a clarity that would serve me well in all the challenges yet to come.